the quiet whisper of ancient mysteries, a journey into the heart of Atlantis. Today, we invite you on a leisurely and profound immersion into the world of ancient Greek lore and the enigmatic Atlantis. Imagine dusk settling, a soft blanket enfolding you, as the day's worldly concerns gradually give way to silence. We embark on an exploration of a city that may have thrived thousands of years ago, a place where people walked streets forever hidden from our sight and watched sunsets over harbours now resting beneath fathomless waves. Today you will wander through bustling markets, where the air was thick with the scent of spices from the farthest corners of the world. You will hear the gentle murmur of fountains in courtyards, where philosophers once engaged in profound discussions about the nature of existence and truth. Now, allow yourself to fully immerse in this atmosphere. Perhaps the gentle hum of a fan will provide a soothing backdrop. And so we begin our journey into a realm that balances between history and dream, between faint memory and boundless imagination. Imagine yourself walking down a street that no longer exists in a city that may have been real, where the morning light falls differently than anywhere you've ever been. The cobblestones beneath your feet are smooth and warm, polished by countless footsteps over hundreds of years. You hear the gentle sound of water everywhere, fountains, canals, the distant rhythm of waves breaking against the harbour walls. This is Atlantis before the fall, and you sense what an ordinary Tuesday might have been like in the most extraordinary city the world has ever known. But here's the thing about extraordinary places. Most of the time, the people living there are engaged in perfectly ordinary activities. They buy bread, mend broken cartwheels, debate the weather, and ponder what to cook for dinner. The bakery you pass smells of honey and grain. The baker himself is likely the third generation of his family to work in this very corner. His hands are dusted with flour, his face intent on the simple task of feeding his neighbours. The bread here is different from what you know. It's darker, denser, mixed with seeds that give it a nutty flavour. The baker shapes each loaf by hand, just as his grandfather taught him, just as his grandfather's grandfather learned centuries ago. You notice how the buildings around you rise in smooth curves, their walls made of pale stone that seems to glow softly in the morning light. The architecture here follows principles that feel both ancient and incredibly advanced. Each building seems to grow organically from the earth, as if the city itself is alive, breathing with the rhythm of the tides. A woman passes, carrying a basket of vegetables from the market. Her tunic is simple but beautifully woven, dyed in colours that somehow capture the exact hue of sea foam. She offers a polite nod as she passes, as is common in small communities where everyone knows everyone, even in a city that stretches beyond the horizon. The market square ahead buzzes with the soft energy of commerce. Merchants have come from distant lands. Their ships are moored in harbours capable of receiving vessels from all corners of the known world. You hear a dozen languages mingling in the air. Traders from Egypt discuss the quality of gold. Sailors from northern islands compare the merits of different kinds of amber. What strikes you most is how peaceful everything feels. There are no guards marching through the streets, no signs of conflict or tension. The people of Atlantis have created something remarkable, a society where trade flows freely, where different cultures meet and mingle without friction, where the primary concerns are artistic, philosophical, and practical, rather than military. You pause by a fountain in the centre of the square. Water flows from a carved stone figure, not of a god or goddess, but simply an image of the ocean itself. stylized waves that seem to move, though made of solid stone. The water is clear and cool, delivered through an engineering system that rivals what the Romans would build centuries later. Children play nearby, their games involving intricate patterns drawn in the sand, mathematical puzzles that would challenge adults in other civilizations. Education here begins early and continues throughout life. The Atlanteans have discovered that a society is stronger when every member can think clearly, solve problems creatively, and understand the world around them. An old man sits on a bench, carving figures from driftwood. His hands move slowly but surely, and you realize he is not making toys or decorations. He is crafting teaching aids, small sculptures that help children understand geometry, astronomy, and natural science. In Atlantis, even leisure serves a purpose, though that purpose is always gentle, always aimed at growth rather than control. As the afternoon progresses, other rhythms take over. Workshops open their doors, releasing the heat from forges and kilns. Artisans work with metals and ceramics, creating both practical items and objects of pure beauty. There is no rush, no sense that everything must be finished immediately. Quality takes time, and Atlantis has time in abundance. You watch a potter shaping clay on her wheel. Her movements are hypnotically sure. The vessel emerging beneath her hands will eventually hold olive oil or wine, but she treats it as if she is creating a work of art, because in Atlantis there is no true distinction between the useful and the beautiful. Everything is designed to serve both purposes. As evening approaches, you notice how the city transforms. Lamps begin to glow in windows, but these are not the smoky, flickering torches you might expect. The Atlanteans have developed an oil-burning system that produces a clean, steady light. The streets remain safely illuminated without being harsh or intrusive. Families gather for dinner on rooftop terraces overlooking the harbour. The food is simple but varied. Fresh fish, vegetables grown in gardens using sophisticated irrigation systems, fruits that have been carefully cultivated to thrive in this particular climate. Meals are long social affairs, where conversation is as important as the food. You hear music drifting from various quarters, not performances exactly, but the natural outcome of a people trained to value rhythm, melody, and harmony. A young man tunes a stringed instrument while his sister practices scales on a wind instrument that produces sounds like a gentle sea breeze. The harbour never fully sleeps. Ships arrive with the evening tide, bringing goods, news, and travellers from across the known world. The process of mooring is smooth and efficient, managed by harbour masters who have turned the loading and unloading of ships into something of a dance. Night in Atlantis feels different from night anywhere else. The city does not shut down, it transforms. The daytime energy of commerce and industry gives way to contemplation, study, and quiet celebration. Libraries remain open, their reading rooms filled with scholars pursuing questions that fascinate them. Observatories track the movements of stars and planets, adding to knowledge that will inform navigation, agriculture, and timekeeping. As you walk through the residential quarters, you see families engaged in activities that would seem both familiar and strange. Parents help children with their studies, which include mathematics, natural philosophy, and what we might call civics. But they also dedicate time to music, physical training, and practical skills, such as cooking and basic engineering. The wealthy and the poor in Atlantis live differently, but not as starkly as in other civilizations. Wealth here seems more evenly distributed. perhaps because the Atlanteans understood something about economics that later societies would forget, that a community is stronger when everyone has enough, when no one is desperate, when talent can flourish regardless of birth. Before you drift off to sleep today, you might ponder the details that made this daily life possible. How did they organize their government? What did they do about crime, conflict, the inevitable disagreements that arise when people live together? How did they manage to create abundance without destroying the environment that sustained them? These are questions that philosophers and historians have debated for thousands of years. But lying here in the quiet darkness, perhaps the most important question is simpler. What would it be like to live in a place where ordinary life itself was a kind of art, where the daily routines of existence were honed over generations into something approaching perfection? And perhaps as you fall asleep, you might wonder what broke this delicate balance. What forces could have been powerful enough to end a civilization that seemed to have solved so many of the problems that still challenge us today? In that peaceful city where you walked just yesterday, where bakers kneaded bread and children played mathematical games in the square, something was beginning that no one yet fully understood. The signs were subtle at first, the kind you might notice but dismiss, like a slight shift in atmospheric pressure before a storm. That day's dawn broke with familiar normalcy. The harbour master, following established ritual, made his rounds. His gaze swept over the tide charts, which for countless generations had been considered models of infallible accuracy. Yet the water level, contrary to years of experience, was noticeably higher than predicted. This deviation was not catastrophic, but it was enough to make him pause and recheck his instruments with double care. Beyond the city walls, in the vast agricultural lands, farmers were anxiously discovering that some of their age-old irrigation canals had begun to clog, disrupting the usual flow of water. The complex and ingeniously designed water supply system, which had functioned flawlessly for many generations, now showed inexplicable anomalies. From wells that had for centuries provided inhabitants with crystal clear and refreshingly cold water, murky, undrinkable liquid now rose. Mighty springs, erupting from deep within the earth, poured forth water with an entirely different, noticeably saltier and more mineral-laden taste, never before experienced. It was the scholars, immersed in boundless repositories of knowledge, who first began to comprehend and correlate these seemingly insignificant yet unsettling phenomena. Atlantean civilization had always been characterized by a deep attention to patterns, tirelessly striving to identify hidden interconnections between events that at first glance appeared entirely disparate. At their disposal were sophisticated instruments for precise water level measurement, complex devices for detecting the slightest changes in Earth's geological stability, and refined methods for monitoring the behavior of underground springs and vast aquifers. One can easily imagine oneself in one of these magnificent reading halls, where the air was imbued with the wisdom of ages, and scrolls and tablets, preserving centuries of painstaking observations, were piled high. An elderly librarian, custodian of ancient chronicles, carefully unfolded maps on which detailed tide models from the past 200 years were plotted. Her experienced finger slowly traced the lines, revealing barely perceptible but inexorable changes that had accumulated over decades, remaining almost unnoticed. The true nature of the events unfolding around Atlantis proved to be both more complex and far more mundane than the dramatic tales that would be passed down by subsequent civilizations. There was no instantaneous, all-consuming cataclysm where the earth opened up to swallow the great city in a single gulp. Instead, It was a slow, drawn-out process that could have spanned months, even years. The island upon which Atlantis stood had always been in a zone of heightened geological activity. The very same mighty subterranean forces that once formed its natural sheltered harbours, provided hot springs that heated its buildings and yielded generous mineral deposits that fueled its advanced metallurgy, were now, slowly but inexorably, undermining the very foundations of its world. One can imagine walking through the city streets, where every stone breathed history. As the inhabitants gradually became aware of the true nature of the changes, the city's atmosphere was filled not with panic, but rather with a spirit of methodical and meticulous preparation. The Atlanteans, being a pragmatic and far-sighted people, immediately began to develop and implement effective solutions on how to respond to a situation that, while beyond their full control, was not beyond their capacity for reasoned management. The vessels in the harbour began to be loaded differently than before. Instead of familiar trade goods, they took on passengers, carefully selected valuable documents, and essential supplies that might be needed to establish new settlements in uncharted lands. The loading process was methodical and measured, almost routine, as if the Atlanteans had foreseen such a possibility and knew exactly how to act under the circumstances. Families gathered to make difficult decisions about which of their belongings to take, and what, alas, would have to be left behind on the sinking island. It is not hard to imagine these conversations. They were filled with pragmatism, deep emotion, but devoid of despair. These were people who had come to understand the cyclical nature of civilizations, their rise and inevitable decline. They deeply realized that truly valuable things, such as knowledge, interpersonal connections, and moral principles, have the capacity to move, unlike seemingly unshakable buildings and monuments. Artisans and skilled craftsmen worked with an urgency never seen before, yet their efforts were not aimed at saving their own workshops or property. Instead, they fully dedicated themselves to passing on their invaluable skills to the younger generation, who would carry these abilities to new homes and lands. For example, the potter one might have observed working the day before now, spent her time teaching apprentices not only the art of shaping clay, but also how to find quality raw material deposits, build reliable kilns, and create glazes from available materials. The water level continued to rise steadily, yet so smoothly that each new day seemed almost indistinguishable from the last, maintaining an illusion of normalcy. The ground floors of buildings gradually became damp, then submerged, yet people, without losing composure, simply moved to upper levels and continued their daily routines. Bustling markets relocated to elevated squares. The harbour required constant dredging to remain functional, but despite this, ships continued to arrive and depart without interruption. Remarkable during this extraordinary period was the astonishing resilience with which the social structure of Atlantis persisted, even as its physical contours gradually eroded. There was no chaos, no breakdown of public order, no panicked hoarding of resources, and, crucially, no abandonment of the elderly or infirm. On the contrary, the community became even more cohesive, as people deeply understood that they would have to rely on each other in new ways in these changed circumstances. Children continued to attend schools, but their curriculum was significantly expanded to include new, vital skills, the basics of navigation, piloting small vessels, and identifying plants and animals that could serve as food and medicine in unfamiliar environments. Thus, the entire education system rapidly adapted, striving to prepare the coming generation for an existence that would be fundamentally different from their parents' accustomed lives. The religious and philosophical mentors of Atlantis dedicated their time to helping people interpret the unfolding events in terms of profound emotional and spiritual meaning. They spoke of eternal cycles of growth and transformation, the fleeting and impermanent nature of all material manifestations, and how any ending could also be a new, promising beginning. With each passing week, the evacuation process became more systematic and organized. Groups of families boarded ships bound for various destinations, some to long-established colonies, others to entirely uncharted lands where they would have to start anew. Each departure was viewed as both a celebration and a farewell, accompanied by ceremonies that honored both the legacy left behind and the potential for new creation in distant lands. The final stage of these events proved to be surprisingly serene. The last inhabitants of Atlantis consisted primarily of elderly individuals who had voluntarily chosen to remain and maintain essential services until the very end, along with a group of scholars and priests whose sacred mission was to preserve and protect the civilization's most vital knowledge and invaluable cultural treasures. One can imagine them, by the light of oil lamps, working in buildings whose ground floors were already consumed by water, meticulously wrapping scrolls and tablets, selecting the most significant artifacts for loading onto the last departing vessels. Their work was methodical, almost meditative, as if they were fulfilling a sacred duty that transcended even their own survival. The sinking itself, when it finally occurred, was not so much a catastrophic destruction as a slow, majestic descent into eternal sleep. The magnificent buildings did not collapse with dramatic crashes. They simply settled smoothly beneath the inexorably rising waves, which advanced relentlessly but without any violence. Those Atlanteans who witnessed this end later described it as a strangely beautiful sight, like watching their city transform into something entirely new, rather than simply being erased from the face of the earth. The body of water that finally engulfed Atlantis remained warm and crystal clear. Schools of fish swam unhindered through the window openings of buildings that had for generations served as cozy homes for countless families. The once lush gardens were transformed into underwater forests, where sea plants now twined among what were once carefully tended rose bushes and fruit trees that had generously nourished the entire population. The last ship to depart carried with it not only the final group of evacuees, but also the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that had reached remarkable heights and then met its end with inexpressible dignity and grace. As they sailed away, the passengers could cast one last glance at the tops of the highest spires, which still rose above the water's surface, like individual islands in an archipelago, marking the boundaries of what was once the world's greatest city. As one drifts off to sleep today, one might involuntarily ponder those last ships and their passengers, sailing towards unknown shores, carrying with them all they managed to salvage from their lost homeland. What else did they carry beyond their few belongings? What stories did they tell their children about a place they would never again be destined to return to? And perhaps one might dream of these underwater ruins, where fish now glide freely through the same courtyards one once imagined walking, where fountains that once flowed with fresh water now merge smoothly with the endless ocean currents. Many centuries after the last vessels had departed Atlantis's sinking spires, an elderly Greek man sat in a shaded Athenian courtyard, attempting to recall the precise phrasing of a story that had forever altered his worldview. His name was Solon, and he was widely known as one of Greece's wisest men, a distinguished lawgiver and profound philosopher who had travelled extensively and amassed vast knowledge. This particular narrative had reached him not during his own travels among countless Greek islands or negotiations with distant foreign kings. This story had been recounted to him by Egyptian priests, guardians of knowledge that was ancient even when Greek civilization itself was just emerging and beginning to find its way in the world. One can imagine Solon at a much younger age, perhaps around 60, which was considered quite venerable by the standards of the time, as he walked through the majestic temple complex in Sais, Egypt. The morning was warm but not yet scorching, and the long shadows from the gigantic columns offered welcome coolness from the intense sun. He was there as a pilgrim tourist and an inquisitive student, drawn by reports that Egyptian priests possessed historical chronicles whose antiquity spanned millennia. The priest who met him was even older than Solon. His face was furrowed with deep wrinkles, testifying to years of studying ancient texts and profound contemplation. His name, if Solon ever knew it, was irrevocably lost to posterity. However, the elder's role was perfectly clear. He was a keeper of collective memory and a diligent guardian of traditions that might otherwise have faded into oblivion. They moved unhurriedly through halls richly adorned with intricate hieroglyphic inscriptions that recounted centuries past, of great pharaohs and catastrophic floods, of bloody wars and eras of peaceful rule, of the triumphs and declines of ancient civilizations that existed long before Greece was no more than a scattered collection of small tribes, dispersed among rocky islands and jagged peninsulas. The priest articulated his thoughts slowly and deliberately, as if each word carried an immense weight, requiring delicate balance. He told Solon that the Greeks were like unreasoning infants when it came to comprehending the deep annals of the world. This was not because of any lack of intellectual capacity, but because they had not yet learned to reliably transmit accumulated knowledge across the centuries. "You Greeks," the priest declared, sitting on a cool stone bench in a courtyard where palm trees cast intricate patterns of shade on the ground. "You always begin anew. A devastating flood comes, or an earth-shaking earthquake, or a ruinous war, and your repositories of wisdom turn to ash. Your wise men pass away, and with them, their precious legacy irrevocably disappears. You forget your past and believe that the course of history begins only with your personal recollections." Solon listened with the imperturbable patience of one who understood that life's most profound and valuable lessons often unfold gradually, step by step, rather than arriving suddenly and dramatically. He inquired about the record-keeping methods the Egyptians employed, and how they managed to safeguard invaluable knowledge from oblivion across many generations, despite dynastic changes and the vicissitudes of fate. The priest pointed to the walls around them, covered in skillfully carved symbols that embody not just individual words, but entire concepts, deep and multifaceted ideas, eternally etched in stone and capable of surviving millennia. "We write on stone what others record on papyrus," he explained. "We train several generations of priests to commit the same sacred traditions to memory. We construct our vast libraries deep underground, where devastating floods cannot penetrate, and all-consuming fire holds no sway." And then, almost casually, as if speaking of last week's weather, the priest initiated Solon into the mysteries of Atlantis. He depicted it not as a fable or ancient legend, but as a genuine historical event, something that occurred as truly as wars, devastating famines, or the founding of new cities. According to the priest's assertions, the history of Atlantis had been meticulously recorded in Egyptian chronicles, as Egypt was one of the civilizations that actively maintained ties with this island kingdom. Egyptian ships engaged in lively trade with Atlantean merchants. Egyptian scholars learned the intricacies of Atlantean mathematics and advanced engineering achievements. When Atlantis began to sink into the abyss, individual refugees managed to reach the shores of Egypt, bringing with them invaluable eyewitness accounts of the catastrophe. Solon asked meticulous questions, characteristic of a thoughtful and diligent historian. He sought to ascertain the precise dates, the island's geographical location, and the specifics of Atlantean political organization. The priest provided answers with the greatest possible accuracy, though he admitted that even from the Egyptian records, some details had faded. Their conversation lasted for many days, perhaps even weeks. Each morning Solon revisited the temple, and each morning the priest unveiled new facets of this long-lost civilization's existence. They delved into discussions not only of Atlantis's tragic end, but also of its social structure, its highly developed agriculture, refined arts, and a political system that apparently harmonized individual freedoms with collective responsibility. One can vividly imagine Solon diligently recording in his dwelling each evening all that he could recall, striving to capture not only the bare facts, but also the very soul of the narrative. A profound sense of wonder and sorrowful loss permeated the priest's account of a civilization that had reached such unprecedented heights and then so irretrievably vanished. Ultimately, Solon's stay in Egypt came to an end, and he returned to Athens, carrying with him this truly extraordinary story. However, here the thread of the narrative takes on a more human and multifaceted dimension. Solon, by then, was a man of advanced years, burdened with numerous responsibilities. He was immersed in political activity, lawmaking, and the countless small details of daily existence in a Greek city-state. The story of Atlantis, for all its astonishing nature, gradually became just one of many recollections from his extensive travels. Solon began to commit the history of Atlantis to writing, intending to compose a full historical work, or perhaps even an epic poem that could convey this tradition to future generations. But the writing process proceeded extremely slowly. The endless demands of daily life proved insurmountable, and the project remained unfinished when Solon passed away. The unfinished manuscript passed from Solon's family to his friends, and then to the friends of their friends. For several generations it remained one of those treasures carefully kept in the libraries of enlightened families, intriguing and potentially invaluable, but never acquiring enough urgency for its completion. This continued until it fell into the hands of a young man named Plato, who was Solon's great-great-nephew, or perhaps his nephew 3 generations removed. The precise genealogical relationship was lost to the currents of time, but the intellectual lineage is quite clear. Plato, by then, was gaining renown as a distinguished philosopher, a devoted student of Socrates, a thinker deeply engrossed in questions about the ideal social order and the best ways for people to live together. One can imagine Plato within the walls of his celebrated academy, the school he founded, located in a shaded olive grove outside the city walls of Athens. He was by then middle-aged, experienced enough to be firm in his ideas, yet young enough to feel genuine excitement for new horizons. Morning sunbeams filtered through the leaves as he delved into Solon's notes on Atlantis, seeing in this ancient tradition something deeply resonant with his own philosophical inquiries. What captivated Plato so much about the story of Atlantis was not only its dramatic demise, but also the detailed description of the society that flourished there before its fall. Before him lay a civilization that had apparently realized many of the aspects Plato considered fundamental to true human happiness: prosperity devoid of inequality, a government free from corruption, and an education system that cultivated both practical skills and profound moral wisdom. However, Plato was too astute a philosopher to merely retell Solon's narrative without subjecting it to profound contemplation. He saw in the history of Atlantis a unique opportunity to explore the questions that so preoccupied him. What is the true foundation of a just society? How can political power be wielded wisely and effectively? And why do civilizations that reach unprecedented heights of greatness sometimes prove capable of self-destruction? Thus, when Plato created his works on Atlantis in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he was doing something far more complex than simply preserving a historical record. He turned to this story as a powerful tool for profound reflections on political philosophy, on the fundamental conditions that foster human flourishing, and on the destructive forces that inevitably lead to their decline. Atlantis, as presented in Plato's monumental works, is both a historical civilization, about which Solon gleaned information in Egypt, and a profound philosophical thought experiment, exploring the boundless possibilities and inevitable limitations of human society. Plato presents it as a narrative recounted by Critias, who, he states, heard it from his grandfather, who in turn received it from Solon himself, in the serene quiet of his academy, surrounded by students who had come to Athens from the most distant corners of the Greek world to grasp philosophical truths. Plato meticulously labored over his rendition of the Atlantis story. The writing process was slow and with utmost attention to detail. Each sentence was carefully weighed to serve both historical verisimilitude and profound philosophical purpose. But remarkably, Plato, like his predecessor, also never brought his narrative to completion. The dialogue Critias, intended as a complete account of Atlantis, abruptly breaks off mid-sentence, leaving the narrative unfinished for the second time in its long journey from the walls of an Egyptian temple to a Greek philosophical school. As you fall asleep today, one might ponder those unfinished manuscripts, those incomplete stories that have somehow preserved enough detail to captivate readers for the next 2,000 years. What is it about an unfinished story that makes it more captivating than a completed one? And perhaps one might dream of this chain of storytellers: the Egyptian priest, Solon, Plato. Each added something to the story but also omitted something. Each preserved the memory but also transformed it, until the story of Atlantis became something that belongs equally to imagination and to history. From these unfinished manuscripts of Plato and the fading memories carefully preserved by Solon, one can attempt to piece together fragmented ideas of what Atlantis' structures might have looked like. Not the grand towers and impossible spires that artists would later conjure in their fantasies, but something far more graceful and striking. An architecture that harmonized with natural forces rather than opposing them. Structures that seemed to grow organically from the surrounding landscape, as naturally as trees or mountain peaks. One can imagine oneself standing at the edge of what was, in forgotten times, the greatest harbour of the ancient world, contemplating a city that rose majestically in gentle terraces from the water's edge to a central plateau where the most significant temples stood. The first thing that would strike you is the dramatic difference of this architecture from anything you have ever seen. The buildings of Atlantis were constructed primarily of stone, yet their masonry differed dramatically from the rough, angular style typical of many ancient cultures. Atlantean architects developed and mastered stoneworking methods with such intricate precision that their blocks joined without any mortar, forming walls that were at once incredibly strong and remarkably graceful. The material itself used in construction was extraordinary, a type of volcanic rock found in abundance on the island. Its natural hue ranged from a soft pale cream to a deep golden, shifting with the light and time of day. When the morning sun illuminated the facades of Atlantean structures, they seemed to radiate an inner warmth, filling the entire city with a sense of life and welcome. But the true genius of Atlantean architecture lay in its ability to integrate water into every aspect of its design. This civilization perceived water not merely as a practical necessity, but as a deeply aesthetic and even spiritual element, capable of transforming the human experience within an urban environment. Walking through the residential quarters, one would notice that every building, from the most modest dwelling to the grandest palace, was designed with the movement and sound of water in mind. Fountains here were not mere decorative additions. They were integral parts of the architectural structure, seamlessly incorporated into courtyards, grand halls, and even rooftop gardens. The engineering solutions required for such comprehensive integration were so complex and advanced that similar achievements would not be replicated for many centuries. The Atlanteans created an intricate system of underground channels and reservoirs that delivered fresh water from mountain springs to every part of the city. However, instead of concealing these utilitarian systems, they made them part of the visual and acoustic experience of the architecture. One can imagine walking through a typical Atlantean neighborhood, where your ear catches the constant gentle murmur of water flowing through channels carved along the streets, where your eyes see fountains serving both practical and artistic purposes, and where it becomes evident how the architecture created unique microclimates, providing coolness in buildings during summer and comfort in winter. Atlantis's public structures were even more impressive. The Great Library, for instance, was conceived as a complex of interconnected courtyards, each with its own unique water feature. There were reflecting pools that created perfect mirror images of the sky, cascading fountains that generated white noise ideal for concentration, and shallow streams that meandered between reading areas like natural dividers. The main temple complex was located at the highest point of the island. However, it was not a single massive structure, like the Parthenon in Athens or the pyramids in Egypt. Instead, it was a collection of smaller buildings, connected by covered walkways, each designed for specific types of ceremonies and contemplation. What would strike you most about these temples was the astonishing naturalness with which they blended into the surrounding landscape. Atlantean architects deeply studied the patterns of wind and weather, the sun's movement throughout the day and the changing seasons, and the natural drainage systems of the land. Their buildings did not fight these natural systems, but rather enhanced them. The largest temple was dedicated not to a specific god or goddess, but to the ocean itself, the mighty force that surrounded their island, granted prosperity through trade, regulated the climate, and provided sustenance. This temple was partially built underground, with chambers extending below sea level, so visitors could experience the sound and movement of water from both below and above. The acoustic properties of Atlantean architecture were particularly sophisticated. Builders understood how the shape and materials of a space could amplify or dampen sound. They knew how the placement of openings could create natural ventilation that also served musical purposes. Many buildings incorporated wind chimes and water features that created subtle, ever-changing soundscapes. The construction technologies employed in Atlantis were so advanced that they were never fully understood by subsequent civilizations. Builders discovered methods for moving and precisely placing massive stone blocks that rival the capabilities of modern construction equipment. But they achieved this through clever engineering, not brute force, systems of levers, counterweights, and inclined planes that allowed relatively small teams of workers to accomplish extraordinary feats. More importantly, Atlantean construction was designed for longevity. Builders recognized that their island was geologically active, subject to earthquakes and gradual changes in elevation. Their architecture incorporated flexibility, joints capable of absorbing movement, foundations that could settle gradually without compromising the structure, and materials that weathered gracefully over time. The decorative elements of Atlantean buildings were carved directly into the stone, rather than applied as separate embellishments. These carvings typically featured natural motifs, waves, sea creatures, patterns derived from shells and coral formations. But the decor always served function, enhancing the building's purpose rather than distracting from it. Atlantis's private homes followed similar principles, but on a smaller scale. Even modest dwellings featured courtyards with fountains, rooftop gardens that provided both food and beauty, and rooms oriented to take advantage of prevailing breezes and optimal lighting conditions. Particularly fascinating is how Atlantean architecture handled the relationship between interior and exterior space. Many buildings featured walls that could be fully opened in pleasant weather, creating spaces that were both interior and exterior. Rooms flowed seamlessly into gardens. Gardens merged with natural landscapes, and the boundaries between built and natural environments became fluid and flexible. Atlantis's workshops and industrial zones were designed with as much care as its temples and homes. Pottery workshops were positioned to capture the best morning light. Metalworking facilities were designed with sophisticated ventilation systems that drew smoke and heat away from workers, while maintaining optimal temperatures for the work being performed. Even the port facilities demonstrated Atlantean genius in combining practical function with aesthetic beauty. Docks were constructed from the same golden stone as the rest of the city, with integrated cargo loading and unloading systems that made the process efficient and graceful. Warehouses were designed with large windows on upper floors that provided natural light while protecting goods from direct sunlight and rain. As the years passed and the island began its slow descent into the sea, Atlantis's architecture revealed another aspect of its sophistication. Buildings did not simply crumble as the water level rose. They adapted. Lower floors were abandoned and sealed off, while upper floors continued to function. Roofs became new ground levels. The city literally learned to live with changing conditions, maintaining its core functions even as its physical form transformed. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, one might imagine these buildings in their submerged state, not ruined and broken, but somehow still beautiful, still holding their essential proportions and relationships. Fish swim through courtyards where fountains once played. Sea plants grow in window boxes that once held herbs and flowers. And perhaps one might wonder what secrets of construction and design went beneath the waves with these buildings. What knowledge of living in harmony with natural forces was lost when the last Atlantean architect sailed off into an uncertain future, carrying in memory the principles of an architectural tradition that would never be fully recreated. Those last ships that sailed from the sinking spires of Atlantis carried more than just refugees. They carried the seeds of new civilizations, fragmented memories of an advanced society, and a desperate hope that somewhere across the vast ocean, they could find land where they could rebuild their lives. But what became of these survivors, and where did their journeys ultimately lead them? One can imagine being aboard one of these evacuation vessels, crowded with families who had packed only what they could carry, sailing towards a horizon that offered no certain destination. The ship is well built, designed by Atlantean craftsmen who understood that their people might have to travel far from home. But it is loaded far beyond its usual capacity. People sleep on deck, and provisions are carefully rationed to last the unknown voyage. The captain, whose life had been dedicated to navigation and years of trading expeditions to the most distant corners of the world, faced an unprecedented dilemma, and even his extensive experience could not fully dispel doubts about the outcome of the current voyage. Familiar sea routes, once serving commercial purposes, led to shores that might prove inhospitable to a vast influx of refugees. At the same time, the vast and uncharted expanses of the ocean beckoned with prospects of new settlements, but concealed countless dangers and trials. On board this single vessel, the entire spectrum of Atlantean society was gathered, as if compressed into a miniature yet living microcosm. Here one could find profound philosophers and diligent farmers, skilled artisans and astute merchants. Among them were white-haired elders who held memories of Atlantis's golden days, and children whose eyes opened to a world already on the brink of irreversible change. Truly astonishing was how these displaced persons managed to organize themselves during the arduous sea journey. Despite the cramped conditions, hardships, and uncertain future, they maintained with extraordinary resilience the social norms and educational traditions that had once distinguished their civilization. Children, despite the circumstances, continued to learn mathematics, natural sciences, and essential practical skills. Adults, in turn, formed committees responsible for developing strategies for various future scenarios. Some of the ships set their course north, towards coastal lands that would later become known as Europe. These vessels followed well-charted trade routes, aiming to reach harbours where Atlantean merchants were known and always met with welcome. Those survivors who chose this direction often possessed strong commercial ties and genuinely believed in the possibility of rebuilding their lives by leveraging existing trade networks. Imagine one of these northern expeditions disembarking on a coastline where Bronze Age settlements were located at river mouths and in sheltered coves. The local inhabitants, of course, initially met these strangers, arriving on extraordinary ships and possessing exotic items, with caution. However, relations between them gradually began to develop. The Atlanteans offered their knowledge and skills in exchange for land and acceptance into the new society. In these nascent communities, it became evident how Atlantean culture began to intertwine with local traditions. The refugees introduced new metalworking techniques, improved agricultural practices, and implemented architectural innovations that local builders skillfully adapted to the materials available to them and the characteristics of the environment. At the same time, the Atlanteans themselves adopted local customs, learned new languages, and gradually integrated into existing social structures. Other vessels ventured westward, delving into waters that few Atlantean navigators had ever thoroughly explored. These expeditions were more adventurous. Their participants were individuals who preferred the uncertainty of unknown lands to the difficulties of adapting to already established societies. Their voyages were significantly longer and more perilous, but they promised the opportunity to create truly new settlements where Atlantean culture could be preserved in a much purer form. The Western expeditions faced challenges that tested every aspect of their seafaring prowess. Fierce storms relentlessly drove ships off course. Food and water supplies dwindled long before the longed-for land appeared on the horizon. Navigation became the art of reading the subtlest signs, changes in weather conditions, barely perceptible ocean currents, and even the behavior of marine fauna. When these brave Western travelers finally reached land, perhaps the shores of Africa or even more distant continents, they discovered landscapes dramatically different from their lost island home. Here stretched dense forests instead of familiar cultivated terraces. Rivers flowed in unfamiliar channels, and the climate required entirely new approaches to agriculture, construction, and the organization of daily life. One can imagine the process of establishing these new settlements, the meticulous selection of sites that could provide fresh water, offered natural defensive positions, and access to vital resources. Shelter and food security always remained the paramount priorities. However, even in these extreme conditions, the Atlantean refugees sought to incorporate elements of their traditional architecture and urban planning principles into their new homes. The early years of these settlements were marked by continuous adaptation and constant experimentation. Crops that thrived easily on Atlantis might not take root in other soils and climatic conditions. Construction methods had to be modified to work with available local materials. Social structures evolved to meet new challenges, while retaining the core cultural values that defined their identity. Some of the refugee communities managed to thrive in their new environments, gradually transforming from temporary camps into permanent towns, and then into metropolises that could rival their lost homeland in prosperity and complexity. These successful settlements became centers of enlightenment and culture, carefully preserving Atlantean knowledge, while simultaneously developing new innovations inspired by their new surroundings. Other settlements faced insurmountable difficulties in their new environments. Harsh climates, hostile neighboring tribes, or simply the profound psychological trauma of losing their homeland made it virtually impossible for some refugee communities to establish stable new lives. These settlements might have lasted only 1 or 2 generations before being abandoned or assimilated by larger local populations. The fate of Atlantean culture in these disparate settlements represents one of the most intriguing aspects of the survivors' story. In some places, the refugees consciously sought to preserve their traditions intact, creating communities that functioned almost as living museums of their lost civilization. Children learned Atlantean songs and lore. Artisans continued to create objects in traditional styles, and scholars diligently worked to preserve the written records of their unique culture. In other communities, integration with local populations occurred much more rapidly. Atlantean refugees intermarried with local families, adopted their customs, and gradually witnessed their distinctive culture merge with broader regional traditions. After several generations, only certain skills, oral traditions, or artistic motifs might remain as barely discernible traces of their Atlantean heritage. The most successful refugee settlements, it seems, were those that managed to strike an optimal balance between preserving their cultural heritage and adapting to new realities. These communities carefully guarded their core cultural values and essential knowledge, while embracing innovations that helped them thrive in their new conditions. The archaeological evidence for these supposed Atlantean settlements is, by its very nature, extremely difficult to identify with complete certainty. How does one distinguish natural indigenous cultural development from the influence of refugees from a long-lost civilization? However, some scholars believe they can trace Atlantean influence in the unexpected appearance of advanced metallurgy, sophisticated agricultural technologies, or distinctive artistic styles in various corners of the ancient world. Perhaps even more significant is the fact that Atlantean refugees could have made invaluable contributions to the development of maritime cultures throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. Their advanced navigation skills, progressive shipbuilding methods, and profound knowledge of ocean currents could have significantly impacted the expansion of trade networks and the spread of cultural exchange. As these disparate communities developed over many generations, they maintained connections with each other whenever possible. Ships carried not only trade goods but also news, stories, and cultural innovations between distant settlements. Thus, an entire network of Atlantean-influenced communities could have formed, united by common origin and continuous cultural exchange. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, one might involuntarily ponder the descendants of those first refugees. Did their communities survive long enough to influence later civilization? Are there traces of Atlantean knowledge hidden within the traditions of cultures that never heard the name of the lost island? And perhaps one might imagine those very first nights in new lands, when exhausted refugees set up temporary camps on unfamiliar shores, looking up at the same stars as their ancestors on Atlantis, and wondering if they would have the strength and wisdom to build something worthy of what they had. Forever lost. The ancient Greeks, who first heard Plato's account of Atlantis, were no strangers to natural disasters. They lived in a landscape shaped by mighty earthquakes and furious volcanic eruptions, where the ground beneath their feet could suddenly shift without warning, and mountains could birth new islands in spectacular displays of fire and ash. An understanding of the history of Atlantis, therefore, is inextricably linked to comprehending how the ancient Greeks experienced and remembered these formidable natural forces. Imagine yourself in the setting of ancient Greece during one of the frequent earthquakes that shook the region. You are in a small coastal town, perhaps on one of the countless islands scattered across the Aegean Sea. The morning begins quite ordinarily. Fishermen prepare their nets for sea. Merchants arrange their stalls in the bustling marketplace. Children play carefree in the dusty streets between tightly packed houses. Then the earth begins to move subtly. At first, it's just a slight, fleeting displacement that makes you wonder if you imagined it. A cup rattles softly on a table. A bird takes anxious flight from its perch. But then the movement becomes unmistakable and undeniable, a swaying, rocking sensation that makes it difficult to keep your balance, as if the solid ground beneath your feet has suddenly turned to pliant liquid. Though the earthquake's duration is measured only in moments, for eyewitnesses it stretches into agonizing eternity. Building structures begin to sway ominously, emitting groaning and creaking sounds. Terrified inhabitants, losing their footing, hastily abandon their dwellings, their gazes wandering in a mix of bewilderment and horror. The animal world reacts most unusually. Dogs bark frantically, horses shy in panic, and even the smallest insects seem to sense a disequilibrium, presaging disaster. As soon as the shaking of the earth finally ceases, a phase of painstaking and urgent work begins. First and foremost, there is a pressing need for a thorough inspection of residential and auxiliary buildings for damage incurred. Cracks in the walls needed to be promptly repaired to prevent further deterioration before the winter rains. Underground springs and wells were often damaged, leading to changes in the taste or difficulty in accessing drinking water. Port facilities and harbours could shift significantly, necessitating extensive dredging or the construction of entirely new piers. In the worldview of the ancient Greeks, earthquakes were perceived not as chaotic natural phenomena, but as a direct and undeniable manifestation of powerful divine will. Poseidon, lord of the deep, also bore the epithet Earthshaker, being the deity behind the trembling of the soil and the giant tsunamis that sometimes crashed upon coastlines after powerful tremors. Their understanding of such catastrophes was inextricably linked to comprehending the complex dynamics of the relationship between gods and mortals, and to recognizing how human actions could influence powerful cosmic forces. However, the ancient Greeks were not only deeply religious, but also very pragmatic people, meticulously studying the patterns and harbingers of natural calamities. Their keen observation noted that certain weather phenomena often preceded tremors. They closely monitored unusual animal behavior and changes in underground water sources, interpreting these as possible signals of impending upheavals. Furthermore, the Greeks developed advanced construction methods for their time, designed so that structures could withstand moderate seismic tremors. Volcanic eruptions, in turn, appeared to them as events even more grandiose, dramatic, and deeply etched in memory than earthquakes. As the Greeks lived in a region where volcanic activity was quite common, they repeatedly witnessed the impressive and simultaneously terrifying process by which subterranean fiery forces were capable of radically transforming the surrounding landscape literally overnight. Imagine yourself on the island of Thera during one of its volcanic awakenings, though not during the colossal eruption that ultimately wiped out the Minoan settlement. From a safe distance, an observer might see the summit of the mountain in the center of the island begin to emit plumes of steam and ash particles, forming an impressive column of smoke and debris that majestically surges skyward and is clearly discernible even from neighboring islands. The onset of an eruption often began with a gradual escalation. Slight tremors were followed by gas emissions, whose acrid scent resembled sulfur and hot rock. The local population, with years of experience living with volcanic activity, immediately began preparations. They carefully secured all unsecured objects, covered wells and food supplies to protect them from the harmful effects of ash, and made the vital decision either to stay and weather the storm or to evacuate to safer areas. As the eruption gained strength, the observer would witness rivers of molten rock that slowly but relentlessly flowed down the mountain slopes, heading towards the sea. Upon contact with water, colossal columns of steam arose, and the cooling and solidifying molten rock formed new land. The soundscape of this process is truly indescribable, a confluence of hissing, deep rumbling, and deafening roar that echoes for many miles around. The consequences of such volcanic eruptions could manifest in two ways. They brought both destructive and unexpectedly beneficial changes. Volcanic ash could devastatingly cover agricultural lands and damage structures, yet simultaneously exceptionally fertile volcanic soil was formed. New land areas created by solidified lava flows opened up opportunities for territorial expansion. Geothermal hot springs, arising from volcanic activity, provided natural heating for buildings and offered significant therapeutic benefits for human health. The ancient Greeks developed a deep and multifaceted understanding of the inextricable link between destruction and subsequent renewal that often accompanied natural disasters. Their observational skills allowed them to notice that forests devastated by volcanic fires eventually regenerated, becoming even more lush and abundant than before. They also recognized that earthquakes, while destroying old structures, paradoxically opened up prospects for building more advanced and robust constructions. Thus, the Greeks understood that the same natural forces capable of unleashing catastrophe upon the world could simultaneously become a source of well-being and prosperity. Such a profound understanding of natural cycles significantly influenced the Greek interpretation of legends and traditions such as the narrative of Atlantis. When Plato depicted a civilization wiped off the face of the earth by earthquakes and floods, his Greek contemporaries readily perceived this as an entirely realistic, even inherent, component of the natural order of the world. They clearly understood how swiftly prosperity could turn to disaster, and how the very geographical factors that made a certain place attractive and desirable could simultaneously contribute to its heightened vulnerability. Moreover, the Hellenes possessed a subtle understanding of the psychological impact that natural catastrophes have on the human psyche. They had personally witnessed how earthquakes and volcanic eruptions could transform people's perceptions of their environment, forcing them to recognize the ephemerality of all human endeavors. It was evident to them that those who survived such disasters often re-evaluated their life priorities, favoring the development of social connections and dedicating much less attention to purely material wealth. Greek historians and thinkers meticulously investigated how natural cataclysms influenced the rise and fall of civilizations. Their observations showed that communities that indulged in excessive comfort and were overly confident in their superiority over nature often suffered the greatest losses when disaster struck them. Those civilizations that maintained a sober awareness of their own vulnerability and embedded principles of flexibility into their social and physical structures had a much greater chance of survival and subsequent recovery. Such a historical perspective undoubtedly influenced how Plato's contemporaries perceived the story of Atlantis. They would have seen it not merely an inconceivable fantasy, but a thoroughly convincing narrative of how even the most highly developed civilization could be brought down by forces beyond human control. The Greeks' accumulated experience of natural disasters also significantly impacted their approaches to urban planning and architecture. They favored building settlements on elevated sites, which significantly reduced the risk of flooding. Their buildings were characterized by relatively simple but extremely robust structures, capable of withstanding moderate seismic tremors. Furthermore, they created well-designed water storage systems that could continue to function even if primary water sources were disrupted. Religious practices in ancient Greece were a direct reflection of a constant awareness and reverence for powerful natural forces. Temple complexes often included special sanctuaries dedicated to deities associated with earthquakes, volcanic activity, and storms. Religious festivals incorporated ceremonies aimed at maintaining harmonious relationships with these omnipotent deities. Prayers and sacrifices were perceived not merely as rituals, but as quite pragmatic measures for preparing for potential disasters, holding as much significance as storing food or ensuring the solidity of structures. The cultural memory of large-scale catastrophes was carefully preserved and passed down from generation to generation through oral traditions, songs, and religious rites, keeping a vivid awareness of these events alive. Older family members, grandparents, recounted to their grandchildren the great earthquakes they had experienced. Poets skillfully wove narratives of natural disasters into their epic tales, and religious mentors constantly reminded communities of the vital necessity of maintaining deep respect for the powerful forces of nature. Such a cultural foundation for understanding catastrophes serves as a key to comprehending why the story of Atlantis resonated so powerfully with a Greek audience. It was not merely a captivating legend of a lost civilization. Rather, it was a profound reflection on themes central to the Greek experience of life and their wisdom on how to live in a world where the ground beneath one's feet could suddenly shift without the slightest warning. As one reflects before sleep today, one might ponder how these ancient experiences of natural disasters resonate with contemporary challenges. Do we, like the Greeks, recognize that our technological breakthroughs do not free us from the power of natural forces? Do our cities and societies possess the degree of flexibility that can help communities withstand and recover from sudden trials? And perhaps in one's dreams one might see those ancient Greek storytellers sitting by campfires on earthquake-shaken islands, weaving threads of stories that helped their communities comprehend both the irresistible might of nature and the unyielding resilience of human culture, transmitting wisdom on how to live with dignity in a world capable of changing without warning. While the minds of philosophers were engaged in debates about the authenticity of Atlantis, and skilled storytellers enriched its legend with new details, archaeologists armed with patient brushes and high-precision measuring tools managed to uncover the material remains of real Bronze Age civilizations that may well have served as the inspiration for Plato's narrative. The most intriguing of these discoveries were made on the islands of Crete and Thera, where the preserved traces of Minoan culture offer tantalizing and provocative glimpses into what advanced ancient societies truly looked like. Imagine yourself walking among the meticulously excavated ruins of Knossos on the island of Crete, where the eminent archaeologist Arthur Evans and his successors unearthed the remains of what was once Europe's first great civilization. The soft morning light illuminates the stone foundations that, in the distant past, supported magnificent multi-story structures, highlighting frescoes that still, with astonishing vibrancy, depict scenes of daily life from nearly 4 millennia ago. The Minoan palace at Knossos was not a single building, but a vast complex of interconnected structures, sprawling over several acres. Walking through the carefully reconstructed sections, a visitor can directly observe intricate urban planning, vast storage facilities designed to hold colossal volumes of grain and oil, workshops for diverse crafts and manufacturing activities, solemn ceremonial areas for religious and political gatherings, as well as residential quarters intended for both nobility and common labourers. What strikes researchers about Minoan architecture is its unique blend of functionality and aesthetic appeal. The ancient builders possessed a profound understanding of the Mediterranean climate, allowing them to create structures perfectly adapted to their environment. Their designs featured internal courtyards that provided cool shade on hot days, light wells that effectively channeled natural illumination into the deepest recesses of buildings, and sophisticated drainage systems designed to manage both domestic wastewater and abundant seasonal rainfall. The famous frescoes discovered at Knossos depict a society that, by all accounts, was remarkably peaceful and prosperous. These artworks show dynamic scenes of young people performing leaps over bulls, an act that was likely part of a religious ritual or athletic contest. Also depicted are solemn processions of elegantly dressed figures carrying offerings, and graceful dolphins swimming in underwater scenes that adorned bathroom walls, lending a particular sophistication to the interiors. However, perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Minoan frescoes is their testimony to a civilization with extensive maritime connections. Images of ships are frequently found in the artwork, alongside goods and people who had evidently arrived from distant lands. This suggests that Minoan culture was not an isolated island community, but a powerful trading empire, actively linking the Eastern Mediterranean with Africa, Asia, and the nascent civilizations of mainland Greece. The Minoans appear to have created the first significant naval power in European history. Their seafaring vessels were advanced for their time, capable of long-distance voyages and transporting substantial volumes of cargo. Archaeological findings strongly indicate that Minoan merchants and colonists established settlements on the Aegean islands, and perhaps even beyond, spreading their influence and trade connections. One can imagine the bustling activity that filled Minoan harbours, ships arriving with copper from Cyprus, gold from Egypt, obsidian from other volcanic islands, and luxury goods from Mesopotamia. The wealth accumulated through this extensive trade supported not only the ruling class, but also a significant middle class, composed of skilled artisans, enterprising merchants, and efficient administrators. Everyday objects discovered at Minoan archaeological sites attest to a high standard of living across all strata of society. Even ordinary homes contained well-crafted pottery, bronze tools, and decorative items. The Minoans developed sophisticated methods of metalworking, textile production, and food preservation, enabling them to sustain a dense urban population and meet its needs. Particularly fascinating in Minoan society is the apparent status of women. Frescoes depict women actively participating in religious ceremonies, athletic events, and court life, suggesting they held positions of real power and authority. The most important Minoan religious figures appear to have been goddesses rather than gods, and priestesses seem to have played a central role in both the religious and political leadership of society. The Minoan writing system, known as Linear A, remains undeciphered to this day. However, the mere existence of extensive written records indicates a complex administrative system. The Minoans meticulously tracked trade transactions, tax collection, and resource distribution on a scale that required detailed accounting and likely a significant number of literate individuals to manage it. But the most striking parallels between the Minoan civilization and the story of Atlantis emerge when moving north from Crete to the island of Thera, known today as Santorini. Here, volcanic activity has preserved one of the most complete Bronze Age settlements ever discovered. The city of Akrotiri, as if frozen in time beneath a layer of ash from a massive eruption around 1600 BCE, presents itself to researchers. Walking through the excavated streets of Akrotiri feels like a journey into a Minoan time capsule. The buildings are remarkably well preserved, with some structures still standing 2 and 3 stories high. Here one can clearly see how Minoan architects adapted their methods to varying conditions, while maintaining their core design principles and engineering ingenuity. The frescoes at Akrotiri exhibit an even higher degree of sophistication than those found at Knossos. They depict scenes that appear to document real historical events. One particularly famous fresco shows a fleet of ships engaged in what appears to be either a military expedition or a solemn ceremonial voyage. Another depicts a landscape incorporating cities, harbours, and natural features that may represent actual existing places. The volcanic eruption that preserved Akrotiri was one of the largest in recorded history, comparable in scale to the 1883 eruption of Krakatoa. The explosion would have been visible for hundreds of miles, and subsequent tsunamis would have devastated coastal settlements throughout the eastern Mediterranean, leaving colossal destruction in their wake. One can imagine the experiences of the inhabitants of Akrotiri as they realized what was happening to their island. Archaeological evidence suggests that the eruption was preceded by earthquakes and smaller volcanic episodes that gave the population time to evacuate. No human remains were found in the buried city, indicating that most people managed to escape before the final catastrophic explosion. But while the inhabitants of Akrotiri may have survived, their civilization did not. The eruption of Thera coincided with the beginning of the end for Minoan culture throughout the region. Within a century, the great palaces of Crete were abandoned, trade networks collapsed, and the Minoan Civilization, which had dominated the Aegean for over 1,000 years, vanished without a trace from history. The parallels between the archaeological evidence from Crete and Thera and Plato's description of Atlantis are striking enough to convince many scholars that the Minoan civilization was, at the very least, one source of inspiration for the Atlantis story. Like Atlantis, the Minoans were a maritime trading empire with advanced technology and sophisticated urban planning. Like Atlantis, they experienced a sudden catastrophic end that was associated with earthquakes and floods. The chronology is also suggestive. The collapse of the Minoan civilization occurred at approximately 900 years before Plato's time, which is close to the 9,000 years the Egyptian priests attributed to the antiquity of the Atlantis story, if one allows for some confusion between months and years or other dating systems. But the Minoan connection to Atlantis raises as many questions as it answers. If Plato based his account on recollections of real Bronze Age civilizations, how much of his story was historical fact, and how much was philosophical speculation? Did the Egyptian priests truly preserve accurate records of Minoan civilization? Or did Plato construct his narrative from other sources, drawing on snippets of information and his own reflections? Even more intriguing, the Minoans themselves may have preserved stories of even earlier civilizations that were lost to natural disasters. The account of Atlantis may represent not direct memories of Minoan culture, but Minoan recollections of their own predecessors, passed down through multiple layers of cultural transmission until they reached Plato's Athens, acquiring new details and interpretations. As you prepare for sleep, perhaps it's worth reflecting on what it means to walk among the real remains of Bronze Age civilizations that achieved such remarkable complexity and then vanished. The stones and frescoes of Knossos and Akrotiri are tangible proof that advanced societies rose and fell in the Mediterranean over millennia, leaving behind only hints of their former grandeur. And perhaps, in your dreams, you will see those Minoan sailors, departing from harbours that now lie beneath the waves, carrying goods, stories, and cultural innovations to distant shores, never imagining that their own civilization would ever survive only in archaeological fragments and half-forgotten legends, becoming part of myths. Roughly at the same time that Minoan civilization was fading in the Aegean islands, something even more dramatic was unfolding across the Mediterranean. A mysterious wave of destruction swept across the great Bronze Age civilizations, toppling empires that seemed unshakable and ushering in what historians call the Bronze Age collapse. At the heart of this upheaval were enigmatic groups known only as the Sea Peoples, raiders or refugees whose origins remain one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. One can imagine oneself as a scribe in the court of Ramses III in Egypt around 1180 BCE, recording the pharaoh's account of massive naval battles that took place in the Nile Delta against foreign invaders who arrived in vast fleets. A reed pen scratches across papyrus as descriptions of these foreigners are recorded. These were people who came from the sea in ships unlike any the Egyptians had seen before, bearing weapons and clad in armor that spoke of both desperation and sophistication in their warfare. Egyptian records describe these sea peoples not as a single group, but as a coalition of various tribes and peoples, each with their own customs and equipment, but united in their movement across the Mediterranean. Some of their names have been preserved in Egyptian hieroglyphs. The Peliset, who may have been the Philistines mentioned in biblical texts, the Cheker, the Sherden, the Denyen, and others whose identities still remain a mystery to researchers. The particular interest in the phenomenon of the sea peoples within the context of the Atlantis legend stems not only from their role as aggressors, but also from their presumed status as displaced persons. These groups, it appears, were people whose accustomed lives had been disrupted by some large-scale catastrophe, forcing them to abandon their homelands in search of new refuges. Egyptian historical records vividly depict them as migrating masses, moving with their families, household goods and animals, clearly indicating vast population movements rather than routine military campaigns. One can vividly imagine the scene as these flotillas of refugees approached the borders of Egyptian territories. Hundreds of vessels carrying not only warriors but entire peoples who had lost their homes and were desperately seeking new land. The Egyptian defenders undoubtedly faced an unprecedented sight. Before them appeared not merely armies eager for conquest and plunder, but entire civilizations in motion, carrying with them all that could be salvaged from some disaster that had befallen their ancestral lands. The period of mass movements of the sea peoples almost perfectly coincides with the era of the widespread Bronze Age collapse that engulfed the entire eastern Mediterranean. The mighty Hittite Empire, whose power extended over significant parts of modern-day Turkey and Syria, virtually ceased to exist overnight. Major trading hubs on the Levantine coast were either razed to the ground or completely abandoned. Even mainland Greece experienced the widespread destruction of its key centres. Archaeological findings from this period paint a picture of devastation that is exceedingly difficult to explain solely by conventional military conflicts or political upheavals. Cities were burned, yet often there were no signs of prolonged sieges. Palace complexes were abandoned, yet valuable items remained untouched, as if the inhabitants had fled in haste. Trading systems that had functioned flawlessly for centuries simply ceased to operate. The mystery is compounded when considering that many of these fallen civilizations possessed quite advanced military capabilities and seemingly should have been able to defend themselves against sea raiders. The Hittites had professional armies and sophisticated defensive structures. The Mycenaean Greeks were known as valiant warriors, occupying strong defensive positions. Nevertheless, in some unknown way, the sea peoples and the general trend of collapse managed to crush these established powers. Some researchers hypothesize that the sea peoples themselves could have been refugees from Atlantis or other highly developed civilizations destroyed by natural cataclysms. This theory could explain their apparent technological advancement, their desperate need for new lands, and their ability to challenge powerful states despite their status as homeless migrants. Imagine yourself aboard one of these refugee vessels, part of a fleet representing all that remained of a once great civilization. Your ancestral homeland may have been wiped off the face of the earth by earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, or rising sea levels. Everything you knew, the cities, the trade routes, the political structures that had provided stability for generations, was irrevocably lost. The ship on which you make this journey is superbly built, designed by craftsmen who deeply understood advanced principles of naval architecture. However, it is overflowing with people and belongings, loaded beyond its usual capacity, for there was no other choice but to take everyone and everything that could be saved. The journey has already lasted longer than anyone anticipated, and provisions are running low. Your fellow refugees represent all strata of society. nobility and farmers, artisans and merchants, priests and warriors. The catastrophe that destroyed your homeland made no distinctions, and now you are all equal in your homelessness. The social structures that once defined your life collapsed with your cities, and upon their ruins, new forms of organization are emerging, based on the practical needs of survival and migration. The fleet carries not only people but also knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of a civilization that may have developed over centuries, navigators with detailed knowledge of sea routes and weather conditions, metallurgists proficient in advanced methods of processing bronze and iron, architects capable of designing buildings resistant to earthquakes and storms. However, this knowledge is extremely fragile, its preservation dependent on the survival of the individuals who carried them. In the refugee fleet, there are no libraries or schools, no stable institutions capable of preserving and transmitting cultural information. Everything depends on memory, on the ability of individuals to remember and pass on what they know to the next generation. The challenges facing these refugees were colossal. They had to find places where they could settle permanently, but most desirable territories were already occupied by established peoples who might not welcome the influx of a large number of foreigners. They needed to rebuild not only their physical lives but also their social and cultural institutions, as well as habitats that could differ significantly from their original homes. Some groups of sea peoples successfully established new settlements. The Phoenicians, for example, formed a distinctive culture along the coast of modern-day Israel, blending elements of their unknown homeland with influences from their new environment. Archaeological evidence suggests that they retained some advanced technologies and artistic traditions while adapting to local conditions. Other groups, it seems, were assimilated by existing populations, contributing their knowledge and skills to established civilizations while gradually losing their distinct identity. The process of cultural integration could take several generations, with each subsequent generation becoming more assimilated into local customs and traditions. The widespread Bronze Age collapse led to the onset of dark ages that lasted several centuries in many parts of the Mediterranean. Trade networks took generations to re-establish. Writing systems were lost and had to be reinvented. Urban civilization itself seemed to recede, giving way to smaller, more localized communities that were less vulnerable to the systemic collapse that had brought down the great empires of the Bronze Age. However, the collapse also opened opportunities for new civilizations to emerge. The Greeks, who eventually created the classical civilization that gave rise to Plato, were descendants of peoples who survived and adapted to the post-collapse world. The knowledge and traditions they inherited included not only their own cultural achievements, but also the influences of various refugee peoples who settled among them. This historical context adds another layer to the interpretation of the Atlantis story. When Plato wrote about a great civilization destroyed by natural disaster and about its survivors scattering across the Mediterranean, he was describing a picture that had, in fact, been repeated many times throughout the region's history. His audience was undoubtedly familiar with stories of migrations and settlements of their own ancestors. The sea peoples represent one of the documented examples of how advanced civilizations could suddenly vanish, leaving behind only fragmentary evidence and half-forgotten stories. Their fate vividly illustrates how cultural knowledge could be both preserved and transformed in the process of migration and resettlement. As you fall asleep today, perhaps you will ponder all the civilizations that have disappeared from history, leaving behind only mysterious traces that archaeologists and historians try to interpret. How many Atlantises rose and fell in the Mediterranean over millennia? And perhaps you will dream of those fleets of refugees, sailing towards an uncertain future, carrying with them the seeds of new cultures that would eventually grow and flourish in ways their passengers could never have imagined, creating connections between past and future that would influence the development of civilization for thousands of years to come. Long before Plato created his philosophical dialogues about Atlantis, and centuries before Solon travelled to Egypt to hear ancient stories from temple priests, the Greeks had already developed their own sophisticated traditions of preserving and transmitting cultural memory. An understanding of how these storytelling traditions functioned helps us appreciate both the power and the complexity of the Atlantis narrative that has reached us through the ages. Imagine yourself in a great hall on a Greek island, perhaps in the time when Homer was composing the Iliad and the Odyssey, centuries before Plato's birth. The evening meal has concluded, and the household has gathered around the central hearth, where a steady fire burns, casting dancing shadows on the walls. An elderly storyteller, a professional bard whose very existence depended on his ability to memorize and perform long narrative poems, prepares to begin the evening's entertainment. This storyteller holds in his memory not one or two stories, but dozens of interconnected narratives that together preserve the history, values, and cultural identity of his people. He knows genealogies tracing families back 20 generations. He can recite detailed accounts of wars fought centuries ago, with the names of heroes, descriptions of their weapons and armor, and the political relationships that led to conflict. However, the master storyteller of the past was not limited to merely reciting a memorized text, like a modern actor performing a script. On the contrary, each time he recreated the narrative, skillfully weaving together traditional formulas, established descriptions, and common plot patterns. This allowed him to create performances that were simultaneously perceived as deeply archaic and remarkably relevant, intimately familiar yet strikingly fresh. The audience did not remain a passive observer, but actively participated in this creative process, responding to the storyteller's performance in a way that directly influenced the narrative's progression. If the listeners showed particular interest in a minor character, the bard might delve deeper into their story. If a part of the narrative seemed protracted, he had the option to shorten it or swiftly move to more exciting episodes. Thus, stories evolved dynamically through this continuous interaction between storyteller and audience, sensitively adapting to changing tastes and interests while preserving their deep, essential content. This age-old tradition of oral storytelling developed sophisticated methods for preserving historical information across many generations. Bards skillfully employed rhythmic verse patterns that significantly facilitated the memorization of extensive narratives. They also actively used recurrent formulas, standardized ways of describing common actions, character traits, or objects. These formulas not only served as powerful mnemonic devices, but also shaped the unique, recognizable style that the audience expected from the performer. What is most significant is that they skillfully wove important cultural information into captivating narratives that people genuinely wished to hear. Historical facts, valuable geographical data, profound moral principles, and practical wisdom all were organically integrated into stories of adventures, romantic experiences, and heroic conflicts. Such tales not only captivated the audience's attention, but simultaneously enlightened them about their own heritage. One can imagine how a story like the legend of Atlantis' destruction might have been preserved and transmitted precisely through such oral traditions. Its dramatic elements, an advanced civilization, moral decline, subsequent catastrophic demise, would have made it an exceedingly compelling spectacle. However, this narrative would also have carried profound lessons about the relationship between human societies and the mighty forces of nature, about the destructiveness of hubris, and about the enduring importance of maintaining reverence for divine power. Each time this story was retold, it inevitably acquired minor variations, adapting to the specific audience and the pressing concerns of the moment. A storyteller performing for merchants might emphasize the commercial aspects of Atlantean civilization. A bard entertaining warriors would likely focus on martial feats and strategies, and a performer at a religious festival might develop the moral and spiritual dimensions of this ancient tradition. Over time, different versions of the same story could emerge, each retaining unique aspects of the original narrative while also reflecting the interests and values of the communities that kept it alive. Some of these versions might remain as close as possible to historical facts, while others took on a more mythological character, incorporating supernatural elements that made the narratives more entertaining but less literally accurate. The Greek tradition of preserving stories through oral performance created a unique living library that proved significantly more flexible and adaptive than any collection of written scrolls. These storytellers did not merely mechanically memorize plots. They became true living embodiments of cultural memory, carrying within them the accumulated wisdom and invaluable experience of countless generations. Imagine a listener attending one such master storyteller, who skillfully weaves together various threads of narrative, connecting the story of Atlantis with other tales of lost civilizations and divine judgment. He might begin with a familiar account of a great island kingdom, then smoothly transition to related traditions, stories of Deucalion's flood, the destruction of Troy, or Odysseus's wanderings through exotic and wondrous lands that might no longer exist. What makes this storytelling tradition particularly relevant to understanding Atlantis is its approach to the relationship between historical fact and narrative truth. Bards perfectly understood that sometimes the deepest truths about the human experience can only be conveyed through stories that, while perhaps not literally factual, are emotionally and spiritually accurate. One can imagine how a story like Atlantis might have functioned in this context. Regardless of whether the island kingdom existed exactly as Plato described it, the narrative itself carried important truths about the rise and fall of civilizations, about the dynamics between human ambition and natural forces, and about how prosperity and power could corrupt even the most highly developed societies. The storytellers who preserved such histories were not historians in the modern sense, whose primary concern is factual accuracy and documentary evidence. Instead, they acted as cultural philosophers, using narrative as a tool to explore the deepest questions about human nature and social organization. Their stories were intended to both teach and entertain, preserving wisdom alongside mere information. Within this tradition, the details of the narrative might change from one telling to another, yet its essential meaning remained constant. A storyteller might describe Atlantean ships, endowing them with different types of sails, depending on whether he was performing for an audience of merchants or farmers. He might emphasize various aspects of Atlantean society, based on the political interests of his listeners. But the fundamental message about the impermanence of even the greatest human achievements would remain unshaken. This remarkable flexibility allowed stories to maintain their relevance across many generations and in diverse social contexts. A narrative that began as a historical account of a Bronze Age maritime civilization could transform into a profound philosophical reflection perfectly suited for classical Athens, and then again transform into a moral lesson relevant to later audiences with different concerns and values. The physical setting of these oral performances also played a crucial role. Most took place in domestic or public spaces, in spacious halls, cozy courtyards, or bustling festival grounds where the audience felt comfortable and relaxed. The storyteller created an intimate atmosphere that encouraged listeners to become deeply emotionally invested in the narrative, helping them to recognize themselves in the characters and situations described. One can imagine oneself in such a setting, as the storyteller reaches the climax of the Atlantis story, the great earthquake and subsequent flood that destroyed the island kingdom. His voice drops to a whisper as he describes the final moments, how the sea slowly engulfs the beautiful terraces and gardens, how the last ships sail from the sinking spires. The audience leans forward, utterly absorbed by the drama unfolding. Although such stories were often already known to the listeners, in these oral performances, the aftermath of the destruction received equal attention. The storyteller detailed the fate of the Atlantean survivors, their desperate struggle to find a new home, their efforts to preserve their cultural traditions in foreign lands. These episodes established a deep connection between the ancient tradition and the immediate experience of the audience, many of whom might themselves have been descendants of migrants and refugees who had endured earlier conflicts and calamities. The storytelling tradition also served as a repository of technical and practical knowledge, integrated into an entertaining format. Descriptions of Atlantean ships might include precise details of naval architecture and navigation methods. Tales of Atlantean agriculture might contain useful information about irrigation and crop rotation. Thus, stories functioned as informal textbooks, preserving and transmitting practical knowledge alongside cultural values. But perhaps most significantly, the oral tradition created an unbroken sense of continuity between past and present, between the mythical world of heroes and gods, and the everyday reality of the audience. When the storyteller described the markets of Atlantis, listeners could relate these descriptions to their own experience of commerce. When he spoke of Atlantean families facing the loss of their homeland, the audience could draw parallels to their own understanding of displacement and adaptation. This deep emotional connection made the stories unforgettable in a way that purely factual accounts might not have been. People remembered these narratives not only because they were entertaining, but because they felt their personal relevance, as the stories helped listeners make sense of their own lives and challenges within a broader context. The Greek storytelling tradition also emphasized the collective nature of cultural memory. Stories belonged not to individual authors, but to entire communities that preserved and transmitted them orally. Each telling was a communal act, with the audience actively participating, helping to shape the narrative's progression. Stories evolved through this collaborative process, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining their core, unchanging character. When written literature began to supplement and then supplant oral tradition, there was both a gain and a loss of something important. Written records could preserve details with greater precision, but they lacked the flexibility and immediacy of live performance. They could reach a wider audience across greater distances, yet they were unable to adapt to local concerns and interests with the same sensitivity. The historical transition from oral to written cultural heritage transformed human perceptions of narratives. Texts fixed in writing stimulated the development of a more analytical and critical understanding of stories, whereas live oral performance traditionally cultivated deep emotional empathy and personal identification of listeners with the characters and central ideas. Each of these methods possesses its undeniable significance, yet they foster entirely different kinds of interaction between narratives and those who receive them. Understanding the depths of this ancient tradition of transmitting tales allows one to penetrate the essence of the Atlantis myth's incredible allure, which has not faded over many millennia. The narrative itself functions on multiple semantic layers simultaneously. It appears as both a historical testimony and a profound philosophical reflection, as an instructive parable and as a captivating spectacle. Its content easily adapts to diverse cultural environments, invariably retaining its fundamental ability to prompt humanity to ponder the fine line between the grand achievements of civilization and the inexorable power of natural forces. As one prepares for sleep today, one might deeply consider how tales and traditions tirelessly continue to shape our understanding of the world. Even in the current era of pervasive digital communications and dominant scientific analysis, humanity still resorts to the art of storytelling to comprehend the multifaceted and sometimes convoluted experience of existence, to carefully preserve accumulated cultural values, and to delve into the exploration of those fundamental questions for which no unequivocal, factual answers exist. And perhaps in one's dreams one will be transported to images of those ancient storytellers, whose voices, transcending millennia, bring us wisdom and astonishing tales of civilizations that flourished long before our own emerged, constantly reminding us that some fundamental truths possess too profound a significance for their comprehension to be solely the domain of historians, that certain kinds of knowledge can only be preserved through the ancient art of storytelling, which reveals to us not only the sequence of events that transpired, but also their profound meaning, their true significance. In this concluding shared intellectual journey through the legendary lost world of Atlantis, explorers find themselves not in the lands of ancient Egypt or within classical Athens, but right here, in modern reality, surrounded by the soft glow of electronic gadgets and the faint hum of advanced technological systems. Yet, despite the change of eras, the narrative of the great island kingdom continues to speak to us across millennia, offering profound insights and serious warnings that resonate as urgently and significantly today as they did for Plato's original listeners. One can imagine walking through a bustling modern city during twilight hours, observing lights illuminating in countless windows of high-rise buildings, and contemplating the endless flow of vehicles on highways that weave districts and neighborhoods into intricate patterns, which would seem truly magical to ancient observers. Our current world order has achieved technological heights that would, without doubt, plunge the Atlanteans into profound astonishment. Instant communication spanning colossal distances, modes of transport achieving speeds unattainable by any ancient vessel, buildings whose pinnacles soar significantly higher than their most majestic temples. Nevertheless, carefully examining this modern urban landscape, an observer might discover that many of the problems that ancient Atlantis supposedly faced retain their acute relevance even today. These include the search for an optimal balance between economic prosperity and ecological sustainability, the maintenance of social cohesion amidst rapid change, and the methods of preserving distinct cultural values while inevitably adapting to new technologies and global interconnections. The narrative of Atlantis speaks to the modern world largely because it touches upon universal, timeless themes concerning the cycles of flourishing and decline of great civilization. Any highly developed society inevitably faces the complex task of effectively managing its own achievements, preventing a situation where abundance breeds excessive complacency, and diligently preserving the fundamental values and practices that initially ensured its success. One can clearly observe these patterns by analyzing humanity's own historical experience. Civilizations that become overly enamored with their power over natural forces, that are too convinced of their own technological superiority, and that exhibit unwarranted disregard for the wisdom accumulated and carefully preserved in traditional practices, often find themselves utterly unprepared to face those grand challenges capable of bringing down even the most highly developed social formations. The ecological aspects presented in the tale of Atlantis appear exceedingly relevant specifically for our time. Plato's narrative depicts a civilization that achieved outstanding prosperity, made possible by its dominance over natural resources and a profound understanding of engineering and agricultural principles. However, this very dominion likely instilled in the Atlanteans excessive self-confidence in their ability to fully control natural forces, which ultimately proved to be beyond human influence and unmanagement. Modern humanity faces very similar dilemmas concerning the relationship between rapid technological progress and the need to ensure ecological sustainability. Civilization has achieved unprecedented capabilities in extracting resources from the earth, transforming natural systems, and sustaining a numerous urban population under conditions that would naturally support far smaller communities. However, these grand achievements simultaneously generate new kinds of vulnerabilities, the true scale of which humanity is only beginning to comprehend. The narrative of Atlantis serves as a vivid reminder that even the most developed civilizations remain profoundly dependent on natural systems that operate according to their own inherent logic, not in deference to human preferences or meticulously crafted plans. Climate change, seismic activity, powerful volcanic eruptions, and other natural cataclysms continue to exert a formative influence on human history in such a way that even the most sophisticated technological equipment proves incapable of fully controlling or predicting their manifestations with absolute precision. However, the narrative of Atlantis is not merely a cautionary tale of ecological disaster. It also contains profound reflections on social and political challenges that retain their relevance for modern democracies and the entire system of international relations. In Plato's account, a society is depicted that gradually lost its original course, despite achieving outstanding material and cultural triumphs. According to the ancient tale, early Atlantean civilization was distinguished by outstanding justice, profound wisdom, and harmonious cooperative relations both within the island kingdom itself and in its interactions with other peoples. However, over time, boundless prosperity and acquired power gradually corrupted these original fundamental values. The Atlanteans began to display increased aggression towards neighboring states. Their focus shifted towards material enrichment at the expense of cultural and spiritual development. They became overly convinced of their own superiority and lost due respect for other peoples and their distinct traditions. An observer can easily recognize similar patterns in the annals of modern nations and great empires. Societies reaching peaks of power and prosperity often face colossal difficulties in preserving the fundamental values and practices that formed the foundation of their initial success. Abundance of material wealth and advanced technologies can foster a false sense of invulnerability, which in turn leads to erroneous decisions and ultimately to inevitable decline. The international dimensions present in the history of Atlantis also eloquently echo the realities of our modern world. Plato portrays Atlantis as a powerful maritime trading empire whose connections extended throughout the Mediterranean and far beyond. The power of this civilization partly stemmed from its unique ability to foster peaceful cultural exchange among diverse peoples, acting as a connecting bridge between distant communities possessing varied languages, customs, and natural resources. The modern global economy is profoundly dependent on similar, widely branched networks of international trade and global communications. Like ancient Atlantis, our current prosperity rests on complex and interconnected systems of exchange that unite communities separated by vast geographical distances. However, these very systems generate critical interdependencies capable of making entire regions extremely vulnerable in the face of disruptions originating in the most distant corners of the planet. The sudden collapse of Atlantean civilization serves as a powerful reminder to humanity of how swiftly even the most complex systems can crumble when their key components fail. Current global supply chains, extensive communication networks, and highly sophisticated financial systems have generated an unprecedented level of prosperity and provided unparalleled convenience. Yet they simultaneously generate entirely new kinds of vulnerabilities that humanity is only beginning to grasp and learn to manage effectively. Perhaps most significantly, the story of Atlantis serves humanity as a powerful reminder of the enduring value of cultural memory and the vital necessity of preserving wisdom. Those who survived the grand catastrophe were able to rebuild their lives in new lands partly because they carefully preserved and brought with them the knowledge and values of their once lost civilization. These people preserved not only practical technical skills but also profound philosophical insights into the principles of organizing societies and ways of maintaining harmonious relationships among diverse communities. The modern world produces colossal volumes of information, yet humanity sometimes faces serious difficulties in distinguishing between mere data and true, profound wisdom. The rapid pace of technological transformation can prompt us to hastily discard traditional knowledge as outdated, even if that knowledge contains invaluable and eternal truths.